What if everything you thought you knew about ancient agriculture was just the beginning of a much deeper story? What if lost civilizations held secrets of survival and collapse baked not just into their stones, but into the soil beneath their feet? Imagine walking through terraces carved by hands that mastered microclimates, or through sunken fields where water whispered life in a landscape too harsh to farm. Picture islands where great statues watched as forests vanished and fields failed, deserts where underground aqueducts tapped ancient waters, only to run dry. What drove these societies to thrive, and what caused their sudden silence? How did empires built on ingenuity and adaptation collapse under the weight of ambition and nature's unyielding limits? Could we, standing in their footsteps, read the warnings left hidden in earth and stone? From the Andes to Mesopotamia, from the deserts of Arabia to the jungles of Southeast Asia, these forgotten places offer fragments of answers, clues about balance, resilience, and the fragile relationship between humanity and the land. Will we uncover lessons about sustainability lost to time? Or are we destined to repeat their mistakes? The journey ahead will take you inside hidden valleys, ancient farms, and buried cities where the ground holds stories of brilliance and failure. This is a voyage into the erased epics of agricultural history, where every field has a tale and every crop roots us deeper into the mystery of survival. Step forward, explorer. What secrets will you uncover? The wind was cold when I first saw them. Circular terraces carved into the Peruvian Highlands, descending like an amphitheater into the earth. But this wasn't built for voices. It was built for crops. The Inca called this place Moray, and modern agronomists call it a mystery. Each terrace ring sits at a different microclimate, a different temperature zone, as if the entire site was a living laboratory. I ran my hand along the stone walls, still perfectly fitted after centuries. No mortar, no collapse, just precision. The locals told me stories of experimental crops, of seeds that could survive anywhere because they were tested here first. But here's the part that kept me awake that night. The soil composition changes with every level, deliberately. Someone engineered this valley to simulate dozens of ecosystems in one place. The deepest terrace sits about 100 feet below the rim. I climbed down slowly, carefully, feeling the temperature shift with each level. At the top, the wind cut through my jacket. Halfway down, the air was still, almost warm. At the bottom, standing in the center of those concentric rings, I felt surrounded by stone and silence. The temperature difference between top and bottom can reach 15 degrees Celsius. 15 degrees. In a space smaller than a football field, archaeological evidence suggests the Inca used Moray to adapt crops from the jungle lowlands to survive in highland conditions. They would plant seeds at the bottom level in warm, protected soil, then gradually move successful plants upward, ring by ring, generation by generation, until the crops could survive at 13,000 feet above sea level. It was agricultural evolution compressed into geography. Genius translated into stone. But as I examined the soil more closely, taking samples from different terrace levels, I noticed something troubling. The uppermost terraces, the ones exposed to the harshest conditions, showed signs of severe depletion. The organic matter was almost non-existent. Whatever nutrients had once been there had been extracted, harvested, used up. The Inca had pushed these experimental fields hard, perhaps too hard. The very success of the system may have led to its overuse. I found pottery fragments embedded in one of the lower walls, evidence of habitation, of people who lived and worked here. But I also found abandonment, terraces that had collapsed and never been repaired, irrigation channels that had silted up and been left to decay. Moray wasn't destroyed by conquest or catastrophe, it was simply emptied, used until there was nothing left to use. The sun was setting as I climbed back to the rim, casting long shadows across the rings. I thought about the last farmer who worked here, the last person to plant seeds in this remarkable place. Did they know they were the last? Did they see the soil failing, the yields dropping, the system breaking down? Or did they simply wake up one day and decide to leave, to find easier land elsewhere? Standing at the edge, looking down into those perfect circles, I realized something unsettling. We think of ancient civilizations as primitive, as people who didn't understand the land. But the Inca who built this understood perfectly. They created a system so sophisticated we're still trying to figure out how it worked. And yet, even they couldn't make it last forever. Even they pushed too far, which raises a question I couldn't shake as darkness fell over the valley. If they couldn't sustain this miracle of engineering and agriculture, what makes us think we can do better? The air thinned as I approached the vast, bleak expanse of the Bolivian Altiplano. Every breath felt sharper, colder, carrying the ghosts of those who once wrested life from this unrelenting plateau. I was searching for the remnants of the Tiwanaku, a civilization that flourished over 1,000 years ago near High Lake Titicaca. The sun caught in the drizzle, glittering on water pooled in ancient channels, evidence, still visible, of a field system so advanced and so resilient it baffles modern scientists. What I found wasn't just engineering, it was survival written into the landscape. Sunken gardens and raised fields stretching for miles, their pattern only visible from the low-flying drone we used to map them. Each field was a testament to ingenuity. Low, flat planting mounds, cradled by broad canals, caught the meager warmth of day and released it through the cold Altiplano nights. These canals moderated frost, one of the greatest threats to a highland farmer. Water became a protective blanket, lifting temperatures by a few precious degrees, just enough to save a harvest from ruin. I stooped to run my hands through the saturated soil of one of the abandoned fields. The earth, built up from centuries of canal sediment and decomposing organic matter, smelled impossibly rich. It rivaled any farm plot I'd seen in my time. Beneath my fingers, bits of ancient potato and quinoa rested in the darkness, relics from when these valleys fed thousands. The Tiwanaku used muck dredged from the canals, teeming with nutrients from aquatic plants and bird droppings, to keep this land fertile. Every handful seemed to whisper the story of planning, renewal, and adaptation. But as I walked the ridge between two flooded beds, another story became clear. The fields farthest from the heart of Tiwanaku were neglected, collapsing into tangled marsh. Closer to the ruins, some were packed with silt, their intricate water systems clogged, their engineering forgotten. I found layers of charcoal in the earth, evidence that, near the end, the people tried to burn reeds and organic debris to renew a soil that had finally grown tired. Some of the burned layers were nearly pure ash, a desperate gesture when all other strategies failed. I sat amid the crumbling stonework and looked across the miles of abandoned wetlands. The scale was breathtaking. Tens of thousands of hectares once worked, fed, and renewed by hands we will never know. Yet here, nature was reclaiming what had been borrowed. Tall grass and wild reeds now anchored earth once carefully managed. Drought and shifting rains, recorded in tree rings and lake sediments, meant that even the best design could be overwhelmed by nature's turns. I met with Aymara guides, descendants of those who survived Tiwanaku's collapse. Their voices softened as they pointed out the places where their grandfathers tried to rebuild the old fields, seeking guidance in ancient patterns. Modern agronomists, too, are repurposing waru agriculture, inspired by how these fields produced more, resisted frost, and restored fertility without imported chemicals. I realized that this valley's past isn't just memory, it is a blueprint hidden in plain sight, offering hope to future generations willing to listen. Dusk settled, bringing a bite to the wind. I watched the mist settle into the fields, turning the last rays of sunlight into quicksilver. I wondered, did the Tiwanaku know the end was coming? Did they watch the weather change, the yields dwindle, the water recede? The silence of the valley gave no answer. Yet as I left, I couldn't help but look beyond, toward the distant terraces where human ingenuity once bloomed. Where are the other sunken gardens in hiding? What lessons, now erased from textbooks, are still waiting in fields that stubbornly refuse to forget? Somewhere ahead, I sensed more signs of survival, more clues in stone and silt, waiting for another explorer to unearth their story. The heat rose in waves from the sandstone as I climbed above Petra, following traces of walls that shouldn't have existed. Everyone knows Petra as the rose-red city carved into cliffs, the treasury gleaming in the narrow seek. But few know about the terraces that once covered the highlands above, the agricultural miracle that fed a trading empire in the heart of the desert. I found them on the northern slopes, tier after tier of ancient farming platforms cut into hillsides, now stripped bare by wind and sun. These weren't simple rock piles. They were engineered systems, each terrace positioned to catch the brief winter rains that fell between October and March. The Nabateans, the master traders who built Petra, understood something crucial. Water is wealth, and in the desert, agriculture is power. I traced the remains of stone channels that once carried water from wadi dams to these terraces. The ingenuity was breathtaking. They didn't just build dams, they separated entire watersheds, dedicating specific water sources to the city and others exclusively to agriculture. City water never competed with farm water. Every drop had its purpose, its destination, carefully managed across a landscape that receives rain only in violent, short bursts. The terraces themselves told stories in soil and stone. I knelt on one platform, digging carefully through the layers. The earth was still structured, still showing the careful preparation the Nabateans had made 2,000 years ago. They grew wheat, grapes, and olives here, turning this arid highland into what archaeologists now call a green agricultural suburb, a garden in the wasteland. But beneath the ancient farming soil, I found the evidence of collapse. White crystals glittered in the dirt, salt, layer upon layer of it, deposited by centuries of irrigation. The Nabateans had brought water to the desert, but water in arid lands always carries dissolved minerals. And when that water evaporates in the brutal summer heat, the minerals stay behind. Salt accumulates, slowly at first, invisibly, then catastrophosally. I examined terrace after terrace, finding the same pattern. The lower levels, closer to the water sources, showed the worst salt damage. The upper terraces, receiving less irrigation, had fared better but were eventually abandoned as the labor became unsustainable. The Nabateans tried to adapt. I found evidence of modified channels, attempts to redirect water flow, experimental terrace designs. They knew something was wrong. They fought to fix it. By the 3rd century, the extensive farming that had made Petra wealthy was already declining. Archaeological evidence shows the terraces continued producing in limited capacity for centuries more, but the golden age had passed. The green suburb withered. The complex water management systems once maintained by an organized state fell into disrepair, and eventually the people moved on, seeking easier land in the nearby Wadi Musa Valley, where natural springs still flow today. I sat on a terrace wall as the sun began its descent, painting the distant treasury in shades of amber and blood. Below me, Petra glowed, eternal and empty. Above me, the terraces stretched in silence. The Nabateans had built an empire on trade, but they sustained it with agriculture. They mastered the desert, turned stone into soil, brought abundance where none should exist. And for a while, it worked brilliantly. But brilliance has a cost. Every season of irrigation deposited more salt. Every harvest took more from the soil than the brief rains could replenish. Success bred expansion, and expansion bred desperation. The very techniques that created wealth eventually poisoned the land that supported it. I thought about modern agriculture as darkness crept across the valley, about irrigation projects in California's Central Valley, in Australia's Murray-Darling Basin, in India's Punjab, about salt accumulating in soil worldwide, hidden beneath fields that look green and healthy. The Nabateans left us a warning written in white crystals in abandoned terraces. But warnings only work if someone is listening. And as I descended into the gathering dark, I wondered what other valleys are dying in silence waiting for an explorer. The boat drifted silently through green water, propelled by a wooden pole pushed against the shallow bottom. Around me, willows drooped over narrow canals, their roots trailing into the murky depths. This was Xochimilco, the last surviving fragment of the Aztec agricultural miracle. But I wasn't here to admire what survived. I came to find what was lost beneath the sprawl of Mexico City. The Chinampas, floating gardens built by layering mud and vegetation into rectangular islands, are famous. Tourists visit them, UNESCO protects them, farmers still work them. But few realize that what remains is just a fraction, a tiny remnant of a system that once covered nearly 30,000 acres of Lake Texcoco. The lake is gone now, drained by Spanish colonizers and filled by modern development. 20 million people live where water used to be. I worked with archaeologists using ground-penetrating radar and historical maps to trace the ghost network beneath the city. Every construction site, every subway excavation, every foundation dig revealed more evidence. Rectangular patterns in the soil, canal outlines preserved in clay, willow root systems fossilized in sediment. The scale was staggering. This wasn't just farming. It was an engineered ecosystem supporting hundreds of thousands of people in Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. The genius of the Chinampas system lay in its elegance. Build a frame of stakes and woven reeds. Fill it with layers of mud dredged from the lake bottom, rich with nutrients and organic matter. Plant crops on top. Anchor the entire structure with fast-growing willows whose roots would bind everything together. The result was soil so fertile it could produce 7 harvests per year: corn, beans, squash, tomatoes, chilies, flowers. An endless cycle of growth sustained by the lake itself. But I found something troubling in the deeper archaeological layers. Evidence of rapid expansion during the final century before Spanish contact. New Chinampas built closer together, canals narrowed to create more planting space, willow trees cut down before they could properly anchor the soil. The Aztecs were pushing the system beyond its limits, driven by a population that had swelled to perhaps 200,000 in the capital alone. I examined soil cores taken from buried Chinampas discovered during subway construction. The upper layers showed the characteristic rich black earth of a healthy system, but deeper down, the layers told a different story. Compaction, waterlogging, algae blooms preserved in sediment. The water flow between Chinampas had become restricted as the network grew denser. Stagnant water meant less oxygen, less nutrient circulation, less life. The system was suffocating under its own success. Spanish accounts from the conquest describe Chinampas in decline, some already abandoned, others producing far less than in earlier times. The Aztecs knew something was wrong. Archaeological evidence shows attempts at remediation, widening some canals, abandoning overly dense sections, building new Chinampas in previously unused shallow waters. But they were running out of space, running out of time, running out of lake. Then the Spanish arrived, and everything accelerated. The siege of Tenochtitlan destroyed countless Chinampas. The subsequent drainage of Lake Texcoco eliminated the rest. By the 19th century, only the Xochimilco fragment remained, protected by its distance from the city center and the dedication of farmers who refused to abandon their ancestors' methods. I stood on one of the surviving Chinampas as the sun set, turning the canal water into liquid gold. Around me, farmers loaded flowers into boats, continuing a tradition over 600 years old, but the water level was dropping. Pollution from the city was seeping in. Development pressure was mounting. Even here, even in this UNESCO-protected zone, the system was under threat. The Aztecs built paradise in the lake. They created abundance where there was only water and mud, and for centuries it worked brilliantly. But every civilization faces the same temptation. If this much is good, wouldn't more be better? They built Chinampas until there was no room left to build. They crowded them until the water couldn't flow. They harvested until the system couldn't recover. And when the Spanish arrived with their weapons and diseases, they found an agricultural system already strained to breaking. But what lessons do we carry from that breaking point? As my boat pushed away through darkening waters, I wondered, what other ancient systems collapsed, not from weakness, but from the weight of their own ambition? The dust storm cleared just enough for me to see them. Stone terraces climbing the mountains of Yemen, tier after tier stretching into the haze like a stairway abandoned by giants. The wind still carried grit that stung my eyes and coated everything in fine powder, but through that veil of dust, I could make out what I came for: the ghost of a green past, written in stone across a landscape now stripped to bone. I began the climb in the early morning, when the heat was merely oppressive instead of unbearable. Each terrace was a testament to labor, to hope, to the belief that this mountain could be made to yield. The stone walls stood intact after 2,000 years, dry stacked with a precision that spoke of expertise passed down through generations. But the soil they once held, the rich earth that fed an empire, was mostly gone. The locals in the valley below call these the old farms, but they don't remember who built them or when they were abandoned. The knowledge died with the farmers, lost to time and migration and the slow erasure of memory. But I came prepared with historical texts, with Roman accounts that described this region as Arabia Felix, Arabia the Blessed. 2,000 years ago, this wasn't a wasteland, it was a breadbasket. I climbed higher, tracing the remains of irrigation channels that once distributed water from mountain springs to each terrace level. The engineering was sophisticated, gravity-fed systems that required no pumps, no machinery, just understanding and patience. The Sabaean kingdom grew frankincense here, myrrh, grain. They fed the incense trade that connected Rome to India, that made this corner of Arabia wealthy beyond measure. But wealth breeds expansion, and expansion breeds pressure. At the upper terraces, where the climb left me gasping for breath, I found the evidence of their mistake. I knelt and dug my fingers into what remained of the soil. Inches, just inches of thin, depleted earth clinging to bedrock. In some places, the bedrock itself showed through, bare stone where nothing would ever grow again. This was the price of success. As the population grew, as demand increased, as the trade routes demanded more and more frankincense and myrrh, the farmers pushed higher up the mountains. They terraced slopes that were too steep, areas where the soil was already thin, places that should have been left as forest or grazing land. And they farmed without rest, without rotation, without giving the land time to recover. I found pottery shards mixed with the remaining soil, evidence of settlements that once thrived at these elevations. Small farming communities, entire families living on these terraces, working them season after season. But I also found abandonment. Terraces where the retaining walls had collapsed and never been repaired. Channels clogged with debris from decades or centuries of neglect. The silence of places where human voices once echoed daily. The decline would have been gradual at first, harvests dropping slightly year by year, soil thinning imperceptibly. But in an environment this marginal, gradual becomes catastrophic. By the time the Islamic expansion reached Yemen in the 7th century, many of these terraces were already dead. The people had moved down to lower elevations, to easier land, leaving the mountains to erosion and time. I sat on a terrace wall as the afternoon heat peaked, looking down at the valley, then up at the mountains. The scale of what was lost struck me. Miles and miles of terraces, tens of thousands of hours of labor, centuries of accumulated knowledge about which crops grew where, when to plant, how to maintain the soil, all of it gone. Not destroyed by conquest or catastrophe, but simply exhausted, used up, pushed beyond the point of recovery. The wind picked up again, pulling at my jacket, threatening another dust storm. I began the descent, carefully navigating the ancient steps. And as I climbed down through the empty terraces, I thought about the fine line between abundance and excess, between using the land and using it up. The Sabaeans had turned desert mountains green through ingenuity and determination, but they mistook temporary abundance for permanent capacity. They forgot that even stone eventually erodes, and soil once lost takes centuries to rebuild. And as the dust swirled around me, obscuring the terraces once more, I wondered what other green valleys have we already turned to dust, and how many more are waiting their turn. They call them the eighth wonder of the world. The rice terraces of the Philippine Cordilleras, carved into mountain slopes so steep I had to use both hands to climb to the upper levels. 2,000 years of continuous cultivation, generation after generation maintaining walls and channels and paddies that seemed to defy gravity itself. But I wasn't there to admire their beauty. I was there because they're dying. The terraces stretched before me in the morning light, tier upon tier ascending into mist. Each level was a marvel of precision. Stone walls fitted without mortar, irrigation channels calibrated to feed the terrace below with exactly the right amount of water. The Ifugao people built the system using indigenous knowledge passed down through oral tradition, through observation, through intimate understanding of their land. I met with an elder named Miguel in the village of Batad, one of the most spectacular terrace complexes. His hands were weathered, scarred by decades of maintaining the walls, clearing the channels, planting and harvesting rice in paddies his ancestors had worked for countless generations. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully, and what he told me was sobering. The young people are leaving. The terraces require constant care, constant labor, and the modern economy offers easier paths, better money, less backbreaking work. I climbed with Miguel to inspect a section of terraces that had recently collapsed. The retaining wall had given way during heavy rains, sending tons of soil and rice plants cascading down the mountain. The damage was extensive, and repairing it would take weeks of hard labor, carrying stones up the steep slope, rebuilding the wall by hand, replacing the lost soil. Miguel shrugged when I asked if he would repair it. "Maybe," he said, "if I have time, if I can find help." The truth became clear as we walked the terraces. Sections that had collapsed years ago remained unrepaired, slowly eroding further with each rainy season. Channels clogged with vegetation nobody had time to clear, paddies lying fallow because there weren't enough hands to plant and harvest them. The system was collapsing not from external force, but from internal abandonment. But there was another problem, one less visible but equally destructive. I took soil samples from terraces at different elevations, and the laboratory results told a troubling story. After 2,000 years of continuous rice cultivation, the soil was exhausted. Nitrogen levels were critically low. Organic matter had been depleted. The Ifugao had maintained the physical structure brilliantly, but the soil itself was worn out. Miguel explained the traditional methods: burning rice straw to return nutrients, rotating certain paddies with sweet potato crops, allowing some terraces to rest for a season. But modern pressures, the need for consistent harvests to support families, had shortened these rest periods. Chemical fertilizers helped for a while, but they were expensive and didn't replace the organic richness the soil had lost over centuries. I sat on a terrace wall, looking down at the village below and up at the mountains above. The scale of what was being lost struck me deeply. This wasn't just agriculture. It was a living cultural heritage, a testament to human ingenuity and persistence. But it was also a warning about sustainability, about the limits of even the most carefully managed systems. The Ifugao had kept the balance for 2 millennia. They had passed down the knowledge, maintained the structures, respected the land. But the modern world broke that balance. Economic migration pulled the young away. Market pressures demanded more production from exhausted soil. And the climate itself was changing, bringing heavier rains, longer droughts, unpredictable weather that disrupted planting cycles refined over centuries. As I descended from the terraces in the fading light, I passed abandoned paddies reclaimed by jungle, stone walls slowly disappearing under vines and moss. Miguel walked with me partway, then stopped to look back at the terraces, his life's work and his ancestors' legacy. He didn't say anything, but his expression spoke volumes. "This is ending," his eyes said, "and I don't know how to stop it." The question haunted me as I left the Cordilleras. What happens when the people who know the land, who understand its rhythms and limits, can no longer sustain themselves on it? What happens when economic reality and agricultural tradition collide? The Ifugao Terraces survived 2,000 years of typhoons and earthquakes and colonial occupation, but they might not survive the 21st century. And if a system this sophisticated, this carefully maintained, this deeply rooted in culture can collapse, what hope do our modern monocultures have? What lessons are we ignoring as we watch these ancient terraces crumble into jungle? I descended into darkness, my headlamp cutting through air that hadn't moved in centuries. The stone stairway spiraled down, hand-carved steps worn smooth by feet that stopped walking them over 1,000 years ago. I was beneath Cappadocia, Turkey, in one of the underground cities carved from volcanic rock. But I wasn't looking for the churches or living quarters tourists come to see. I was searching for something historians barely mention: underground farms. The chamber opened before me, roughly circular, perhaps 20 feet across. The ceiling arched overhead, carved with the same precision as everything else in these subterranean cities. But what caught my attention were the grooves in the walls. Rectangular channels cut into the stone at regular intervals. Planters. Spaces where wooden boxes once held soil and crops. I ran my fingers along one of the grooves, feeling the tool marks still visible after so many centuries. The people who built these cities, primarily Christians fleeing persecution between the 3rd and 10th centuries, didn't just hide underground. They lived there, sometimes for months, and living requires food. Ventilation shafts climbed through the rock above me, narrow passages that brought fresh air from the surface hundreds of feet overhead. I followed one with my light, tracing its path upward until it disappeared into darkness. These shafts served dual purposes: air circulation and light. Dim, filtered sunlight would have reached some of the upper chambers, enough for certain crops. Mushrooms in the deepest levels, sprouts and herbs closer to the light. I found evidence of water channels too, carved passages that diverted underground springs through the city. The system was elegant, gravity-fed, requiring no pumps or machinery. Fresh water flowed through living areas, through growing chambers, finally draining away through waste channels that led back to the surface. Everything had its place, its purpose, its carefully engineered function. But as I explored deeper, following passages that led to lower levels, I found abandonment, growing chambers where the planter grooves had crumbled, where rock falls had crushed whatever structures once stood there, ventilation shafts that had collapsed, cutting off airflow and light, water channels clogged with sediment and debris. The archaeologist I worked with, a woman named Icy who had spent 15 years studying these underground cities, explained what happened. The farming systems worked brilliantly at first, small scale, carefully managed, producing enough to supplement food brought from the surface. But as populations swelled during periods of intense persecution, the demand increased. More chambers were converted to growing spaces. More soil was hauled down from above, more water was diverted to irrigation, and the soil began to fail. Without sunlight, without natural decomposition cycles, without the microorganisms that thrive in open air, the underground soil lost its vitality. Crops grew stunted, yields dropped, diseases spread in the damp, still air. They tried to compensate with organic matter, with animal waste, with ash from cooking fires. For a while it worked, but you can't fool soil forever. I examined samples ACE's team had collected from the planter grooves. The analysis showed soil completely depleted of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The basic nutrients plants need had been extracted harvest after harvest with nothing adequate to replace them. The underground farms had been pushed beyond their capacity, beyond their ability to regenerate. By the time the persecution ended, when Christians could finally live openly on the surface, many of these underground cities were already failing. The ventilation systems, constantly battling humidity and carbon dioxide buildup, were breaking down. The farms were producing less each season, and the sheer labor of maintaining these subterranean systems, the constant hauling of supplies down and waste up, had become unsustainable. I sat in one of the abandoned growing chambers, my headlamp casting shadows on the carved walls. The weight of the mountain pressed down from above, hundreds of feet of solid rock. I tried to imagine the desperation that drove people to farm here, in eternal darkness, in spaces that fought against life at every turn. How hungry do you have to be to grow food in the dark? How desperate to make the impossible work? But I also felt admiration. These people didn't just survive, they innovated. They took hostile space and made it livable. They engineered solutions to problems most farmers never even consider. And for a time, against all odds, it worked. The underground farms kept people alive during the worst periods of persecution. As I climbed back toward the surface, my legs aching from the steep ascent, I thought about the limits we push, the boundaries we cross in pursuit of survival. The underground farmers of Cappadocia proved humans can grow food almost anywhere, but they also proved that almost anywhere isn't the same as sustainably anywhere. Even their ingenuity couldn't overcome the fundamental truth. Soil needs light, needs air, needs the cycles of nature to remain alive. And when we cut it off from those cycles, when we push too hard for too long, even the most determined farming eventually becomes just holes in the ground, empty grooves in ancient stone, monuments to ambition that outpaced possibility. What other impossible solutions are we forcing right now, betting everything that this time will be different? The jungle had swallowed it whole. Vines thick as my arm wrapped around stone channels. Tree roots, massive and pale, crushed the remains of retaining walls. But as I hacked through the undergrowth with a machete, following GPS coordinates from aerial surveys, the truth emerged stone by stone. Angkor wasn't just a temple complex. It was the center of the most sophisticated water management system the medieval world had ever seen. I stood at the edge of the West Moray, a reservoir so massive it looked like a natural lake, 8 kilometers long, 2 kilometers wide, built entirely by human hands over 1,000 years ago. The scale defied comprehension. I tried to imagine the labor, the planning, the absolute faith required to move that much earth, to build walls that could hold back that much water. Tens of thousands of workers, decades of construction, all to feed a city. The archaeologist leading me through the site, A French woman named Claire, who had spent 20 years mapping Angkor's hydraulic network, explained what we were seeing. Over 400 square miles of canals, reservoirs, moats, and embankments, all interconnected, all calibrated to capture monsoon rains, distribute water through the dry season, and support 3 rice harvests per year. The Khmer Empire fed a population that may have reached 1 million people, making Angkor one of the largest pre-industrial cities on Earth. But the system had a fatal flaw. It required constant expansion. As the population grew, more canals were dug, more forests were cleared to make room for rice paddies, more water was diverted from rivers and streams. The system worked brilliantly as long as everything went according to plan, but nature rarely cooperates with plans. I followed Claire through sections of the canal network that showed signs of desperate late-period modifications. Channels hastily widened, their banks reinforced with whatever stones were available. Secondary canals cut through older structures, ignoring the original engineering logic. Reservoirs that had silted up, their capacity reduced by decades of erosion from deforested hillsides upstream. The soil cores told an even more troubling story. Claire's team had extracted samples from rice paddies throughout the Angkor complex. The deeper layers from the height of the empire showed rich organic soil. But the upper layers, from the final centuries before collapse, showed something else: waterlogging. The intensive irrigation had raised the water table so high that the soil became saturated, unable to drain properly. Salinization followed. The same white crystals I had found in Petra and Mesopotamia glittered in the Cambodian soil. We walked to one of the temple complexes, Ta Prohm, where massive trees now grow from the ruins themselves. The roots snake through corridors, split walls, lift entire sections of carved stone into the air. It's beautiful in a haunting way, this marriage of jungle and architecture, but it's also a monument to abandonment, to systems that exceeded their capacity and collapsed. The dendrochronology studies, the analysis of tree rings from the region, revealed what triggered the final crisis. A series of severe droughts hit Angkor in the 14th and 15th centuries, followed by devastating monsoons. The hydraulic system, designed for predictable rainfall, couldn't handle the extremes. Canals dried up, then flooded catastrophically. Rice paddies baked hard as concrete, then turned to swamps. The carefully calibrated balance shattered. I found evidence of emergency repairs everywhere. Stone blocks pulled from temple walls to shore up canal banks. Desperate attempts to dig new channels when the old ones failed. Reservoirs hastily dredged to remove accumulated silt. But by then, it was too late. The system was too complex, too interconnected. When one part failed, it cascaded through the entire network. The people didn't leave all at once. Claire showed me evidence of a gradual abandonment spanning decades. Outer neighborhoods emptied first, their canals left to silt up, then intermediate zones. Finally, even the temple complex itself was partially abandoned, though some priests and caretakers remained for centuries. The great hydraulic civilization of Angkor withered not from conquest, but from its own success, its own ambition, its inability to adapt when the climate shifted. We sat in the shade of a crumbling temple wall as afternoon rain began to fall. The water ran off the ancient stones, flowing through channels carved 900 years ago, still functional in their fundamental design even as the jungle reclaimed everything around them. Claire pointed out how the temple's drainage system still worked perfectly, directing water away from the foundations. The Khmer engineers knew their craft. They just couldn't predict that the entire regional climate would shift, that the rains they depended on would become unreliable, that their vast hydraulic empire would become its own vulnerability. As we made our way back through the jungle, I thought about the fragility of complex systems, about how sophistication can become weakness when conditions change. The Khmer built a marvel of engineering, a city that shouldn't have been possible, and for centuries it was glorious. But they built it on the assumption that tomorrow would be like today, that the rains would keep coming on schedule, that the land could keep producing forever. They were wrong. And as the rain fell harder, turning the path to mud, I wondered, what assumptions are we building our world on? What happens when our systems, even more complex than Angkor's, face changes they weren't designed to handle? The sand was hot enough to burn through my boots. Each step sank ankle deep into dunes that stretched endlessly in every direction, rippling like frozen waves beneath a sky bleached white by the sun. But I kept walking, following ground-penetrating radar signatures that promised something impossible: an ancient farm in the heart of the Sahara. This was the land of the Garamantes, a civilization that thrived 2,000 years ago in what is now southern Libya, and they did it through a technique that defied the desert itself. I found the entrance half buried in sand, a stone-lined shaft descending into cool darkness. This was a foggara, an underground aqueduct designed to tap fossil water trapped deep beneath the desert. I secured my rope and descended carefully, my headlamp illuminating walls cut with precision through solid rock. The air temperature dropped with every meter. By the time I reached the bottom 30 feet down, I was shivering in the sudden cold. The tunnel stretched before me, perfectly level, following the ancient water table westward, toward what had once been fields. I followed it for over a mile, my light reflecting off stone worn smooth by water that stopped flowing 15 centuries ago. Vertical shafts punctured the ceiling every 50 meters, providing ventilation and access for maintenance. The engineering was brilliant, the ambition staggering. The Garamantes built hundreds of these foggaras, creating an underground network that tapped into aquifers formed during the last ice age when the Sahara was green and wet. That water, trapped beneath the desert for 10,000 years, was finite, a fossil reserve. But the Garamantes didn't know that. How could they? The water flowed abundantly, supporting wheat fields, barley fields, grape vineyards, and olive groves in the middle of the world's largest desert. I emerged into a wadi, a dry valley where the foggara would have originally surfaced. My local guide, a Tuareg man named Ahmed, whose ancestors had stories of the old green times, pointed out the faint rectangular patterns still visible in the sand. Fields, hundreds of them, stretching across the valley floor. We walked the ancient boundaries, and I dug down through the sand, searching for the soil layer beneath. 3 feet down, I found it, dark earth, still structured, still showing the marks of ancient cultivation. I took samples carefully, sealing them for later analysis, but I could already see the problem: salt. White crystals glittering in the dirt, the accumulated residue of irrigation in an environment where evaporation far exceeds rainfall. Ahmed showed me the remains of wells, stone-lined shafts that had been dug when the foggaras began to fail. The Garamantes had noticed the water pressure dropping, the flow decreasing, so they dug deeper, trying to reach more water, to extend their miracle a little longer. Some of these emergency wells went down over 100 feet, an incredible feat of manual labor in solid rock. But you can't mine water forever. The aquifer, recharged only by rare rains that took millennia to seep down through the rock, was being depleted faster than it could recover. The fogaras that once flowed steadily became seasonal, then trickles, then dry. The fields withered, the crops failed. The Oasis civilization built on borrowed time finally ran out of time. I found evidence of the final desperate years in the abandoned settlements. Storage buildings enlarged to hold grain against longer and longer periods of shortage. Trade goods from North Africa and sub-Saharan regions. Evidence of increasing dependence on imported food as local production collapsed. And finally, abandonment. Pottery left in place. Tools dropped where they lay. Entire towns emptied as people moved on or died trying to stay. The archaeological surveys using satellite imagery revealed the true scale of what was lost. Over 6,000 square kilometers of once cultivated land now buried under dunes. A civilization that supported perhaps 50,000 people reduced to legend and ruins. The Garamantes proved humans could farm the desert through ingenuity and engineering. But they also proved something more troubling, that technological solutions to environmental limitations only work as long as the resources hold out. I stood in the middle of that buried valley as the sun descended toward the horizon, painting the dunes in shades of copper and gold. The wind was picking up, the daily sandstorm beginning. Ahmed wrapped his taggle musk tighter and gestured toward our vehicle. Time to leave. This place belonged to the desert now. But as we drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about modern agriculture, about aquifers dropping worldwide, about the Ogallala under the American Great Plains, about water tables falling in India and China and the Middle East, about wells drilled deeper every year, about farmers racing to extract water faster than their neighbors. The Garamantes didn't know their water was finite. They thought the fogaras would flow forever because they had always flowed within living memory. What's our excuse? We have the data, the science, the projections showing aquifers depleting worldwide. And yet we keep drilling deeper, keep pumping faster, keep pretending that tomorrow's problem isn't today's responsibility. The Garamantes left us a warning written in sand and empty tunnels and fields that haven't grown anything in 15 centuries. But as the desert swallowed my view of that lost valley, I wondered, are we even listening? Or are we just digging deeper wells, betting everything that somehow, this time, the water won't run out? The salt was everywhere, crusted on the ground, glittering in the sun, choking the remains of canals that once made this land the cradle of civilization. I walked through southern Iraq, through the remnants of Sumerian fields that fed the world's first cities 5,000 years ago. They invented irrigation here, diverting the Tigris and Euphrates to turn marshland into farmland. And it worked. For centuries, it worked brilliantly. But beneath my feet, in the soil itself, I found the evidence of their fatal mistake. Each time they irrigated, they deposited a thin layer of salt, invisible at first, negligible, but over generations, over centuries, it built up. I dug down through the layers with a soil auger, extracting cores that told the story of accumulation, of slow poisoning, of a civilization that didn't understand what it was doing to its foundation. The Sumerians were brilliant. They built cities, invented writing, developed mathematics, created the first complex bureaucracies. But they didn't know about soil chemistry. They didn't understand that water in arid regions carries dissolved minerals, and when that water evaporates under the brutal Mesopotamian sun, those minerals stay behind. Salt accumulates, slowly, inevitably, lethally. I worked with Iraqi archaeologists examining ancient cuneiform tablets, administrative records from Sumerian cities. The tablets recorded grain yields, taxes collected, agricultural production. And the pattern was unmistakable: declining harvests. Year by year, decade by decade, the yields dropped. By 1800 BCE, wheat yields in some areas had collapsed by over 60%. The tablets also revealed the Sumerian response. Around 2000 BCE, they began switching from wheat to barley. Barley is more salt-tolerant, able to survive in conditions that kill wheat. The switch bought them time. For a few more centuries, the fields continued producing. But barley has limits too. Even barley eventually fails when the salt concentration gets high enough. I visited the site of Lagash, one of the great Sumerian city-states. The ruins stood silent in the desert, mud brick walls eroded by wind and time. But the ancient canal network was still visible, traced in slight depressions across the landscape. One canal in particular caught my attention. The Enmetena Canal, built around 2400 BCE to divert water from the Tigris. This canal was supposed to be salvation, a massive engineering project that would bring abundant water to Lagash's fields. And it did, for a while. Production increased, the city prospered, but the canal also raised the local water table, bringing salt-laden groundwater closer to the surface. Within a century, the cuneiform tablets recorded rising salinity around the canal, fields turning white, desperate attempts to leach the salt away with even more water. It made the problem worse. I examined soil samples from the areas served by the Enmetena Canal. The salt concentration was still elevated 4,000 years later. Some sections were so saturated with salt that vegetation still struggled to grow. The canal that was supposed to save Lagash contributed to its decline. Engineering without understanding, ambition without wisdom. By 1500 BCE, much of southern Mesopotamia was in crisis. The great Sumerian cities of Ur, Uruk, and Lagash were shadows of their former glory. Political power shifted northward to Babylon, to regions where the soil was less damaged, where irrigation was newer and less intensive. The south, the birthplace of civilization, became increasingly marginal. The irony haunted me as I walked through those salt-crusted fields. The Sumerians succeeded so completely at irrigation that they destroyed the land that sustained them. They were victims of their own ingenuity, their own success. They transformed the landscape, fed millions, built the foundation of all subsequent civilizations, and in doing so, they poisoned the soil for millennia. I met an Iraqi farmer named Hassan who was trying to rehabilitate some of the ancient fields. He showed me the techniques modern agronomists recommended: deep plowing to break up salt deposits, drainage systems to lower the water table, gypsum applications to displace sodium. It was slow, expensive work with uncertain results. Some fields responded. Others remained sterile despite years of effort. The damage the Sumerians inflicted 5,000 years ago was still visible, still limiting what could be grown. As the sun set over the Iraqi desert, turning the salt-white fields into fields of gold, I thought about the present, about the Central Valley of California. where irrigation is depositing salt faster than it can be removed. About Pakistan and India, where millions of acres show rising salinity. About Australia, where salt is creeping into previously productive land. We have the science the Sumerians lacked. We understand soil chemistry, we can measure salt concentration, we know exactly what's happening. And yet, we keep irrigating, keep depositing salt, keep pushing toward the same end. The Sumerians have an excuse. They were the first. They were learning as they went, pioneering techniques nobody had tried before. They couldn't have known that their irrigation would slowly poison their fields. But we know. We have their example, their warning, written in white crystals and abandoned cities and soil that still won't grow food after 5,000 years. We know, and we're doing it anyway. As darkness fell over the Mesopotamian plain, I couldn't shake one thought. If the inventors of civilization couldn't solve this problem with all their ingenuity and determination, what makes us think we can? Or worse, what makes us think we're even trying? The mounds rose from the flat Illinois landscape like pyramids of earth, their slopes softened by 1,000 years of rain and wind. Cahokia, the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, once held 20,000 people at its peak around 1100 CE. But I wasn't there to explore the impressive earthworks or walk the ancient plazas. I was there to understand why they left. Why this thriving metropolis, at the height of its power, was abandoned within a few generations. I worked with soil scientists from Washington University, taking core samples from what were once vast maize fields surrounding the city. We drove hollow tubes deep into the earth, extracting cylinders of soil that held centuries of agricultural history compressed into layers. The lab analysis would take weeks, but I could already see the problem with my own eyes. Depleted, gray dirt that crumbled to dust in my hands. Cahokia was built on maize. Corn sustained the population, fueled the labor that built the mounds, supported the complex social hierarchy that organized thousands of people into a functioning city-state. The fields stretched for miles in every direction, planted and replanted every season with the same crop, year after year, generation after generation. They didn't practice crop rotation, they didn't let fields lie fallow, they just kept planting corn until the soil had nothing left to give. The soil core results confirmed what I suspected: monoculture. Century after century of growing only maize, extracting nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium without adequate replacement. The organic matter content, the rich humus that makes soil alive and productive, had been stripped away. What remained was essentially dirt, mineral particles held together by clay, but lacking the biological activity that sustains agriculture. I walked through the empty fields with Dr. Sarah Barris, an archaeologist who had spent 15 years studying Cahokia's decline. She pointed out subtle variations in the landscape, slight depressions where houses once stood, raised areas that might have been garden plots. But mostly, the land was flat and featureless, giving no hint of the agricultural empire that once fed a city larger than London in the same period. The archaeological evidence painted a picture of gradual crisis. Around 1200 CE, the construction of new mounds slowed. Fewer monuments were built. The population began to disperse, people moving away to smaller settlements, to fresh land that hadn't been exhausted. By 1300 CE, the great city was essentially empty, its plazas silent, its mounds slowly eroding. Dr. Barris showed me evidence from middens, the ancient garbage dumps where archaeologists find remains of meals and daily life. The early middens from Cahokia's Peak showed abundant maize, supplemented with deer, fish, nuts, and other wild resources. But the later middens told a different story, increasingly desperate reliance on maize as other food sources dwindled. The surrounding forests had been cleared for fields. The nearby wetlands had been drained or polluted. The deer population had been hunted down. Maize was all they had left, and the maize fields were failing. There was no conquest, no war, no catastrophic event, just slow agricultural decline that made the city unsustainable. The people didn't abandon Cahokia in a panic. They left gradually, family by family, moving to places where the soil was still productive, where hunting was still viable, where the land could support them. By the time French explorers arrived in the 17th century, the mounds were already ancient mysteries, their builders long gone and forgotten. I climbed to the top of Monk's Mound, the largest earthwork in North America, over 100 feet high and covering 14 acres. From the summit, I could see for miles across the Illinois bottomlands. I tried to imagine this view at Cahokia's Peak. Thousands of houses, smoke rising from cooking fires, people moving through plazas and markets, the constant activity of urban life, all sustained by maize fields that stretched to the horizon. But I also thought about modern agriculture, about the corn belt that now covers this same landscape, about fields that grow corn year after year with only chemical fertilizers to sustain them, about soil held together by chemistry rather than biology, about topsoil washing away at rates faster than it can form, about productivity maintained only through increasing inputs of synthetic nitrogen. The people of Cahokia didn't have synthetic fertilizers. When their soil was exhausted, they had no option but to leave. We have fertilizers, so we stay, believing we've solved the problem they couldn't solve. But are we solving it or just postponing the same end? The soil cores from modern cornfields show disturbingly similar patterns to the ancient Cahokia fields. Low organic matter, poor structure, biological depletion masked by chemical inputs. As I descended from the mound in the fading light, I thought about warnings written in abandoned cities and exhausted soil. Cahokia built the largest urban center in North America and sustained it for 3 centuries. But they built it on monoculture, on taking without giving back, on the assumption that productivity could be maintained through sheer determination. They were wrong. And as I looked out over the modern cornfields surrounding the ancient mounds, I wondered, have we learned anything? Or are we just repeating their mistake on a larger scale, with better tools, betting that this time will be different, that somehow we can take more than the land can give forever? I knew the story before I arrived. Easter Island, Rapa Nui, the remote Pacific island where a civilization built giant stone statues and then destroyed itself through deforestation and overuse. But standing there, walking through the treeless landscape, I realized this story was incomplete. This wasn't just about statues. It was about food, about soil, about what happens when you take everything from land that has almost nothing to give. The island was tiny, just 63 square miles of volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific, over 1,000 miles from the nearest inhabited land. The Polynesian settlers who arrived around 800 CE found an island covered with palm forests, seabirds nesting by the thousands, fertile volcanic soil. It must have seemed like paradise. For a while it was. I walked through what researchers call rock gardens, areas where ancient farmers placed broken volcanic rocks among their crops to improve soil productivity. The rocks, freshly broken, exposed unweathered mineral surfaces that leached nutrients into the soil. It was ingenious, a technique adapted to the island's poor soil quality and limited resources. But recent surveys show these rock gardens covered less than 1% of the island, far less than earlier estimates suggested. This realization was crucial. If the rock gardens were so limited, the island's carrying capacity was much lower than previously thought. Perhaps 3,000 people at most, not the 15,000 or more some scholars had estimated. But even 3,000 people on an island this small with such limited resources created immense pressure on the land. I examined soil cores taken from various locations across the island. The layers told a story of gradual degradation. The deepest, oldest layers showed rich soil, organic matter from decomposing forest vegetation, evidence of a healthy ecosystem. But as I moved up through the layers, through time, the soil changed. Less organic matter, more erosion. Signs of intensive cultivation without adequate recovery periods. The Rapa Nui people cleared the forests to plant crops, primarily sweet potatoes, the staple that sustained them. They burned the palm trees to prepare fields, used the wood for cooking fires, for building, for rolling the massive Moai statues to their platforms. And at first, the cleared land was productive. Burning released nutrients temporarily. The volcanic soil, newly exposed to air and rain, yielded good harvests. But without trees, without the palm forest that had protected the soil, erosion accelerated. Wind stripped away topsoil. Rain washed nutrients into the sea. The exposed volcanic rock weathered quickly in the island's climate, but not quickly enough to replace what was lost. Each year, the soil became a little thinner, a little less productive, a little less able to support the population. I stood at the quarry where unfinished moai still lie, abandoned mid-carving. Over 800 completed statues dot the island, some weighing over 80 tons, transported miles from this quarry to platforms around the coast. The effort required was staggering, but I understood now that these statues weren't the cause of collapse, they were a symptom. A society investing enormous resources in religious monuments even as its agricultural foundation crumbled. By the time European explorers arrived in 1722, the island was almost completely deforested. The Dutch captain who made first contact described a barren landscape, a population of perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 living in harsh conditions. No trees meant no canoes, which meant no offshore fishing, which meant total dependence on land-based food sources that were already failing. The story gets worse. European contact brought diseases that decimated the population. In the 1860s, Peruvian slave raiders took over 1,000 islanders away. By 1870, only 111 native Rapa Nui remained. The cultural knowledge, the oral histories, the understanding of how their ancestors had lived, all of it was nearly lost. But here's what haunted me as I walked the treeless hills. Recent genetic studies suggest the population never experienced the catastrophic collapse described in older narratives. The decline was gradual, the result of environmental limits rather than sudden crisis. The Rapa Nui adapted as best they could, developing rock gardens, shifting to crops that required less soil depth, becoming more efficient with limited resources. They survived their environmental degradation, They found ways to live on exhausted land, but their quality of life declined, their options narrowed, their society simplified. They went from a culture that could move 80-ton statues to one that struggled to feed itself. From master navigators to people trapped on a barren island they had inadvertently created. I looked out at the Pacific, endless blue stretching to the horizon. The isolation was absolute. There was no fresh land to migrate to, no neighboring islands to trade with, no escape from the consequences of their choices. They had to live with what they had done to their home, and as I stood there feeling the wind that no longer had trees to break its force, I thought about Earth, our island floating in the void. We're isolated too, trapped on a planet we're degrading, betting that somehow we'll adapt, that technology will save us, that we won't have to face the same limits the Rapa Nui faced. But what if we're wrong? What if, like them, we're clearing our last forests, exhausting our last soils, using up resources we'll desperately need later? The Rapa Nui couldn't leave their island. Where will we go when we've turned Earth into Easter Island? The Mediterranean sun was brutal as I climbed through the abandoned terraces of Crete's interior. These weren't ancient ruins. These were 20th century farms, left empty by economic migration and European Union agricultural policies. But beneath the modern abandonment, I found the ancient pattern repeating itself, layer upon layer, civilization after civilization making the same mistakes on the same slopes. The terraces stretched up the mountainside, tier after tier connected by crumbling stone stairways. Some walls still stood firm, testaments to craftsmanship passed down through generations. Others had collapsed, spilling their soil down the slope in dark stains of erosion. I climbed carefully, testing each step, watching for loose stones. The olive trees that once covered these terraces were mostly gone, replaced by wild scrub and thorny bushes that grabbed at my clothes. I found pottery shards everywhere. Minoan pottery from 4,000 years ago, the distinctive pattern still visible on broken fragments. Roman roof tiles, their curve designed to shed rainwater. Byzantine coins green with corrosion. Each civilization had farmed this land, pushed it, exhausted it, and then walked away. And each time, the land had recovered slowly, painfully, over centuries of abandonment. But this time felt different. I met an old farmer named Nikos, one of the few remaining, tending a small grove on the lower terraces. His hands were gnarled, his face deeply lined from decades under the sun. He spoke slowly, in Greek, mixed with enough English that I could understand. The soil isn't what it used to be, he said. Even with modern fertilizers, even with modern techniques, the yields keep dropping. He showed me his trees, ancient olives with trunks thick as barrels, some possibly centuries old. They still produced, but less each year. The harvest that once filled dozens of barrels now filled a handful. Chemical analysis is expensive, but it doesn't take a laboratory to see the problem, he said, scooping up a handful of soil. It crumbles to dust in your hand. No structure, no life. I took soil samples from terraces at different elevations, comparing abandoned ones to those still cultivated. The lab results confirmed what Nikos already knew. 4,000 years of farming had depleted the soil to its mineral core. Organic matter content was negligible. Nutrient levels were critically low. The only thing keeping the cultivated terraces productive was chemical fertilizer, and even that was showing diminishing returns. The abandoned terraces told an even more troubling story. Without maintenance, without the stone walls constantly repaired, the terraces were collapsing. Decades of careful engineering, generations of labor building and maintaining these slopes, disappearing under landslides and erosion, the soil accumulated over millennia, washing away in a single rainy season. I sat with Nikos under one of his ancient olive trees, sharing water and bread in the afternoon heat. He talked about his grandfather who had worked these same terraces, about his father who had expanded the family holdings after World War II, about his children who moved to Athens and never came back. Who could blame them, he asked, gesturing at the hard, dry land around us. This is slavery, working soil that gives less every year, fighting slopes that want to collapse, maintaining walls that will outlive any profit they generate. But Nikos also talked about continuity, about the knowledge embedded in these terraces, which slopes catch the morning sun, or water collects after rain, which varieties of olives thrive at which elevations. 4,000 years of accumulated wisdom about farming these particular mountains. And it's all disappearing, he said, because the young people see only the labor, not the knowledge. They see poverty, not heritage. I walked higher after leaving Nikos, climbing to terraces abandoned decades ago. The olive trees had gone wild, branches untrimmed, olives falling unharvested to rot on the ground. The stone walls were still intact here, but for how much longer? Without maintenance, without the constant vigilance that kept water from seeping behind the stones, that cleared drainage channels before they clogged. Even the best wall eventually fails. At the highest terrace, I found something that made me stop. A plaque, weathered but still readable, commemorating the original construction of these terraces by Minoan farmers nearly 4,000 years ago. The same terraces I was standing on, the same stones, repaired and rebuilt countless times but fundamentally unchanged. 4,000 years of continuous use, 4,000 years of human labor maintaining a fragile equilibrium between ambition and sustainability. The Minoans thought these terraces would last forever. So did the Romans. So did the Byzantines. So did Nikos' grandfather. They were all wrong, not because the terraces themselves failed, but because each generation took a little more than the land could sustainably give. Each civilization pushed a little harder, expanded a little further, demanded a little more yield, and the soil, patient and silent, gave what it could until it couldn't give any more. As I descended in the fading light, I thought about modern agriculture, about industrial farming that treats soil as a substrate for chemicals rather than a living ecosystem, about fields that produce enormous yields for a few decades, then collapse, about the assumption that technology will always compensate for ecological limits. The Cretan terraces survived 4,000 years because they were maintained carefully, used sustainably, respected as finite resources. And even then, even with all that care, the soil eventually wore out. What hope do our industrial monocultures have? Our factory farms that mine soil for short-term profit? If 4,000 years of careful farming still led to exhaustion, how long will farming that prioritizes yield over sustainability possibly last? And when it fails, when our chemical crutches stop working and the soil has nothing left to give, will there be anyone left who remembers how to farm without destroying what feeds us? The first thing I noticed was the sound, not birds, not wind through leaves, but the constant whine of pumps, a mechanical heartbeat pulsing beneath fields of wheat and rice that seemed, at first glance, impossibly green. This was Punjab, the proud showcase of the Green Revolution, a place once held up as proof that humans could outsmart hunger with science and technology. But as I walked into the fields, I realized I was standing in another kind of hidden valley, one not carved by mountains, but by numbers, and by water drawn from depths it was never meant to give forever. The soil beneath my boots was flat, dark, and fine. This land used to be a patchwork of diverse crops and native vegetation. Then came the Green Revolution in the 1960s and 70s, high-yielding varieties of wheat and rice, synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and most importantly, tube wells. The harvests exploded. Farmers went from one crop to two, sometimes even three in a year. Punjab became India's breadbasket, feeding tens of millions. The world called it a miracle. I knelt and scooped up the soil. It looked rich. It crumbled easily, but appearances can deceive. Tests taken across Punjab tell a different story. Organic matter has dropped dangerously low in many districts. Nutrient imbalances are common, with excessive nitrogen and phosphorus from repeated fertilizer use and depletion of micronutrients that are harder to replace. The soil, like an overworked laborer, is still standing but tired in ways you can't see from the surface. The real crisis, however, lies beneath. I visited a farmer named Harjeet, whose family had been farming this land for 3 generations. He showed me the old well his grandfather dug by hand, only a few meters deep, where water once came up cool and clear. Now it is dry, abandoned, useless. The modern bore well beside it goes down hundreds of feet. Even that, he said, needs a stronger pump every few years because the water level keeps dropping. In many parts of Punjab, groundwater is falling by more than half a meter every year. Aquifers that took thousands of years to fill are being emptied in decades. We walked to the edge of his field, where a narrow canal once flowed. During the early Green Revolution years, canal water was enough. Then came more electricity, more pumps, more bore wells. Groundwater was free. No one saw the bill adding up beneath their feet. Today, some districts have been labeled dark zones by authorities, a polite term for areas where groundwater extraction is unsustainable, where the invisible reservoir below is on the verge of collapse. The chemical inputs that fueled the boom left their mark as well. In village clinics and research reports, hints of a quieter tragedy appear. Nitrate-contaminated drinking water, traces of pesticides in soil and food, rising concerns about health in farming communities. The land is producing, but at a growing cost, both ecological and human. The miracle is showing its cracks. In the late afternoon, the fields glowed gold under the sun as harvesters moved in slow, efficient lines. It was beautiful, in a way, orderly, predictable, but I could not shake the feeling of standing on a floor that had been hollowed out. The crops looked strong. The system beneath them did not. Climate projections suggest hotter summers, more erratic monsoons, and increased evaporation in the decades ahead. Less water coming in from rain and snow, more water leaving through pumps, a balance slipping further out of reach each season. Harja told me he sometimes thinks about his grandchildren. Will they farm here? Will they have water to plant with? Or will this valley of green turn into a valley of dust and wells that no longer reach anything but stone? I had no answer to give him. The numbers are harsh. Satellites monitoring groundwater storage from space show clear declines year after year across northern India, with Punjab among the worst affected. As the light faded and the pumps kept humming, I realized this valley may be the most shocking of all, not because it is ancient and forgotten, but because it is modern and celebrated, a success story built on borrowed water and rented fertility. We already know how this kind of story ends. We have seen it in Mesopotamia, in the Sahara, in vanished terraces and sunken fields. The difference is that this time the collapse would not just be a line in a history book. It would be televised, it would ripple through markets and dinner tables around the world. Standing at the edge of Harjeet's field, listening to the pump draw unseen water from a shrinking well, I felt the weight of all the valleys I had walked before. The past is not just behind us, it is under us, in the ground we stand on, reminding us gently and sometimes urgently that no miracle harvest is free. And somewhere, in another overfarmed valley, the same hum of machines is already starting to sound a lot like a countdown. The final valley I found was the hardest to reach, not for its remoteness, but because it no longer exists. Lake Texcoco, once the heart of the Aztec Empire, is now Mexico City, a sprawling urban sea built atop what was once fertile farmland. But beneath the concrete and traffic, archaeologists and urban explorers continue to uncover traces of a landscape that once fed thousands and ultimately failed them. I joined a team excavating one of the few remaining open sites near the old lake bed. Hidden beneath layers of asphalt and rubble lay soils rich with ancient secrets. These soils hosted vast amaranth fields, a crop sacred to the Aztecs, not only a food staple but an element of ritual and identity. Amaranth was woven into the fabric of life, its grain providing protein when maize could not. But it was also intensively farmed, far more so than many realize. The legends told by locals and the records left behind noted thousands of acres of amaranth cultivation. Its golden seeds were the lifeblood of ceremonies and daily meals alike. Spanish conquistadors marveled at the scale of the fields, stretching seemingly without end. Yet they also recorded something else. The fields were failing. The soil was worn. Yields declined. Pests gathered. The harvests grew uncertain. I examined soil cores gathered from the excavations. Layers revealed a disturbing trend. Nutrient depletion was evident. The same essential minerals, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, that crops depended on had been steadily extracted. But unlike maize fields nearby, the amaranth fields showed signs of acute vulnerability. Amaranth, delicate and nutrient demanding, was especially sensitive to soil exhaustion. Historical documents suggest that by the late 15th century, just before the Spanish arrived, yields had become so low that the rulers themselves worried. Efforts to restore the soil using organic amendments and fallow periods were hampered by the empire's insatiable demands. Expanding cities and growing populations pressured farmers to plant continuously, pushing the land beyond its limits. Then came conquest and cultural upheaval. When the Spanish banned amaranth cultivation, deeming it pagan, the crop's production plummeted. The fields, already weakened by centuries of overuse, were abandoned in favor of introduced grains. Knowledge of amaranth farming so carefully accrued over generations was lost or suppressed. Amaranth all but vanished for centuries, a silenced echo of the Aztecs' agricultural brilliance. I held a handful of the dusty soil, imagining the generations of farmers who had labored here, planting, tending, harvesting under the watchful eyes of priests and kings. The soil had fed an empire. It had sustained a people's identity, and it had failed them long before the foreign invaders arrived. The collapse was not sudden. It was a slow fade, a whisper of warning hidden beneath golden seeds and time-worn earth. Modern agriculture still grapples with the same challenges: intensive monoculture, nutrient extraction without replenishment, pest pressures, and cultural loss of agricultural knowledge threaten global food security. Amaranth's story is one of forgotten resilience and unheeded caution. It reminds us that even the most vital crops and the richest soils are vulnerable to our care or neglect. As I walked away from the excavation site, the sprawling city rising behind me, I wondered what other fields lay buried beneath our modern metropolises. What ancient lessons are waiting to be relearned? And what knowledge are we losing today, buried beneath concrete or swept away in pursuit of short-term gains? The story of Amaranth and Texcoco is a mirror reflecting not just the past, but our present and a future still writing itself in soil, seeds, and time. Another piece of the puzzle. Another secret swallowed by the ages. Our journey took us across continents, climates, and cultures. Every valley and terrace, a chapter in a silent story of human ingenuity and hubris. We saw empires rise on hills and lakes, deserts and islands, and watched as their soil, their water, their very foundations quietly betrayed them. What all these lost worlds share is a fragile balance, a clear thread woven through time. Nature's limits are never far. Each stop on this expedition revealed a truth softened by layers of earth and forgotten by history. The terraces of Moray, with their microclimate shaped like concentric rings, were a masterclass in adaptation, yet even the Inca could not prevent exhaustion. The sunken gardens of Tiwanaku turned mud and water into life, but drought and overuse silenced their fields. Petra's green hills hid scars of salt that whispered caution as the Nabateans struggled to sustain their desert oasis. From the floating fields of the Aztecs' Chinampas to the mountain steppes of Yemen and the Philippines, we met systems in slow collapse, each sustained by generations of care but vulnerable to change in climate, population, and economy. The underground farms of Cappadocia held life in darkness and desperation, yet exhaustion found them too. Angkor's vast canals were miracles of design until droughts and complexity unraveled the tangled web. The Garamantes farmed fossil water beneath the Sahara's sands, a finite gift squandered by unknowingly mining ancient aquifers. We stepped into the cradle of civilization in Mesopotamia to see how irrigation bred wealth, and salt that slowly starved the soil. We wandered the maize fields of Cahokia and the barren slopes of Easter Island, witnessing lessons in monoculture, deforestation, and the limits of island life. Crete's olive terraces whispered a 4,000-year warning about slow degradation even under careful hands. And finally, we reached into the buried valleys beneath Mexico City to uncover how Amaranth's sacred fields, once abundant, collapsed beneath the twin blows of overuse and conquest. The ground beneath each story shared a common voice. It teaches us about resilience and fragility, about the cost of ignoring what the land can and cannot give. These lost worlds found success in their time, but success brought new challenges no civilization was immune to. Taking endlessly without true renewal ends the conversation with nature. Soils that feed empires wear thin, water once abundant runs dry, terraces crumble. Fields fail, cultures fade. History does not whisper, it waits. It waits in soil cores, in eroded terraces, in fallen stone, in the silent lungs of forgotten cities. These ancient collapses are not just archaeological mysteries, they are warnings etched into the fabric of human survival. You stand now among these echoes, part of a journey tracing where we have been to glimpse where we might go. The earth holds our past as much as our future. It demands respect, patience, and care because it will endure long after empires fall. Our story continues, written in soil, in stone, in the choices we make today. What secrets will you uncover next?